This isn't a battlefield death. This is what happened after capture. Inside a system designed to erase people quietly. In the Pacific War, some of the worst suffering happened far from any front line, below deck, where no camera could see, and where history later felt tempted to look away. Today's episode discusses wartime atrocities in an educational context. No graphic depictions, no propaganda, no symbols. Most people picture the Pacific War as island landings, carrier battles, and pilots in the sky. A war of maps and arrows, a war where the story is a battle, a victory, a surrender. But underneath that story was another war. A war of imprisonment, forced labor, and civilian terror. A war that didn't always leave clean footage. A war that didn't always leave records. And because it doesn't fit the familiar battle narrative, it gets pushed to the margins. So today we're focusing on one physical anchor. One object that explains an entire hidden system. The prison transport ships Allied prisoners called hell ships. A hell ship was usually a standard cargo vessel, not a prison ship by design, just a ship built for crates and fuel and machinery, suddenly used to carry human beings, often unmarked. No visible warning that prisoners were inside, no protection from attack, and no conditions built for survival. If you hear the word ship, you imagine movement, distance, a route, a horizon. For prisoners, the ship itself became the prison, the journey became the punishment. And for many, it became the end. Here's the part people miss. These deaths weren't bad luck. They were predictable outcomes of policy. If you cram human beings into a sealed hold, you get suffocation. If you provide minimal water, you get dehydration and collapse. If you keep people in filth without care, disease spreads fast. And when someone is already starving, even a short voyage can become lethal. Imagine the geometry of it. A metal hatch above you, a ladder down, then darkness, heat that doesn't leave, air that doesn't move, bodies pressed into space that was never meant for bodies. The ship rolls, the floor sweats, the walls sweat, the ceiling sweats, and every hour makes the hold feel smaller, not because the space changes, but because the body loses strength to endure it. And this is where the story turns into something almost impossible to explain. Because hell ships were often unmarked, Allied forces attacked them as ordinary cargo targets. Submarines and aircraft did what they were supposed to do, cut supply lines. And prisoners trapped below deck paid the price. A lot of men died without an enemy ever laying eyes on them. They vanished inside steel, and salt water, and paperwork. It's one of the cruelest paradoxes of the war. A prisoner survives capture, survives the first camp, then dies in transit, because the ship looks from the outside like any other target. And from the inside, there is nowhere to run. No deck, no air, no warning, just a sudden shudder, a sound through metal, a tilt in the world. And then the ocean becomes the final wall. Across the Pacific, more than 90,000 Allied prisoners were transported on these ships. That number should change how you picture captivity in this theater. This wasn't rare. It wasn't an accident. It was industrial. But the hell ship is only the doorway. Because the ship existed for a reason. It wasn't moving prisoners to be humane. It was moving them to be useful, survive the ship, and the story often gets worse. Many prisoners were sent to forced labor sites, mines, rail yards, ports, factories, work that fed the war machine. They were underfed, beaten, and worked while sick, not to rehabilitate them, not to detain them, to extract output, to turn a captured body into a tool. This is where the Pacific's unseen battles connect to a bigger truth. Modern war isn't only fought with weapons, it's fought with systems, fuel, steel, schedules, quotas, shipping, warehousing, the invisible architecture behind the visible violence. And when a state decides human beings are just another resource, cruelty can become efficiency. And that's why the Hell ship matters as an anchor, because it sits perfectly at the center of the system. A ship is logistics made physical. It's how war moves, how war feeds itself, how war sustains momentum. And on those voyages, the prisoner wasn't treated as a human being, but as cargo that happened to breathe. And if the cargo suffers, the schedule still moves. Now, if we stopped the story here, it would already be heavy. But the Pacific's hidden war wasn't only about prisoners of war. It was also a war against civilians, a war of terror meant to crush resistance through fear, mass killings, forced displacement, widespread sexual violence. Not always because discipline broke down, but because intimidation was treated as strategy. Some events became known to the world, many didn't. Records were destroyed, witnesses were silenced, survivors carried the weight alone, and for decades the loudest narratives focused on battles between armies, not on the suffering of the innocent. This is where memory becomes another battlefield. Because after a war, there is always a second war. A war over the story, what gets recorded, what gets translated, what gets taught, what gets simplified into a line in a textbook, and what gets sealed in a file. After the war crimes trials did convict and execute some leaders, but justice was selective. In the new geopolitical reality, some perpetrators avoided accountability because their knowledge or their position was considered useful. That doesn't erase the suffering. It explains why certain stories stayed faint for decades, and why "we didn't know" is sometimes less about evidence and more about whether the world wanted to look directly at what the evidence meant. There's also a simpler reason these stories were buried: shame. Not only national shame, human shame. Because if you look too closely at systems like this, you realize how quickly ordinary structures can be turned into engines of cruelty. A ship, a rail line, a factory, a form, a stamp, a schedule. Nothing supernatural, nothing mystical, just decisions, signed, approved, and executed like routine. And that's what makes the Pacific's unseen battles so important. They show how suffering can be created not only by rage, but by administration, by logistics, by the cold logic of war economics, where a human life becomes a variable, and acceptable loss becomes a phrase that hides 1,000 faces. So why dig this up now? Because these patterns don't belong only to the past. They repeat whenever people become units, whenever prisoners become labor, whenever civilians become the environment, whenever terror becomes policy. Remembering isn't about spreading hatred today. It's not about turning history into a weapon. It's about protecting reality from the comfort of forgetting. Because the silence that buries history is the same silence that allows it to happen again. So when you picture the Pacific War, don't only picture the beach, picture the ship. A cargo vessel, unmarked, sliding across the sea, carrying a prison below deck. A moving reminder that in war, some of the worst violence happens where no camera is pointed, where the world can pretend it doesn't exist. Until someone forces the hatch open in memory and tells the truth out loud. If you want more fact-based episodes on the hidden mechanics of 20th century war, told through one physical anchor each time, subscribe to History in Panels. Sources and references are listed in the description. Thanks for watching.